Dragon Age the Veilguard has been for me the biggest disappointment in terms of gaming I think I've ever experienced in my 32 years on this godforsaken planet. I am a huge Dragon Age fan. I know the world pretty well, I would say. I fell in love with the characters. I played Origins when it first came out an unhealthy amount of times with many variations to see how much I could make the world either better or break it based on my choices. Suffice to say, Dragon Age was special to me. It was my favorite medieval fantasy-esque universe in all of gaming, literature, and whatever else you want to consider. For a lot of you, your go-to is Lord of the Rings, maybe it's Elder Scrolls, but for me, it was always Dragon Age. Something about that world, how the elves were not these majestic beings, but instead slaves who lived a horrible existence. How magic came from a dream world called the Fade, and old gods chose the human race as their arbiters of destruction, which in turn made humanity, in a way, the biggest threat within this particular fantasy world. That was such a cool inversion of what I came to expect from what a fantasy world could be. Dragon Age was dark, it was mature, and it was full of possibilities. Then I heard the series would be going to the Tevinter Imperium, arguably the most xenophobic and racist section of Thedas there ever was. A place where mages didn't believe in same-sex marriages because they valued the concept of magic so much, that they would arrange marriages between houses of mages in order to create offspring for the sole purpose of having new mages with more powerful connections to the Fade. A place where slavery was abundant and normalized, where mages were said to walk around with their elven slaves like dogs on a leash, that they would cut these elves and then use their blood to power their corrupt magic to either impress their friends or push down on the weak and vulnerable even more. Tevinter was the origin of humanity's power, built upon the mass graves of elven civilization, where the dark old gods whispered in man's ear and gifted them the power of magic to destroy the once proud elves, only for those same old gods to use that chaos to create a new world order where they could usher in the Blight, and then bind their souls to these desecrated dragons that were made out of the inhuman flesh of victims so they could raise the world and bring about their dark reign. Dragon Age was a world where it was darker than Tolkien, harsher than say something like Fable and so on. It was a true adult 18+ dark fantasy version of concepts that we all knew and loved. And it was like seeing my family dog get ripped apart by rabid wolves. Tevinter went from this awful slave-powered magical megalopolis that was not only xenophobic but anti-gay and then some, to becoming a drag queen's playground. Gone was the slavery hinted for multiple games. The streets didn't feel unsafe or ruined when you played the game. It all just kinda looked like Dunwall from Dishonored, but lazier and nowhere near as lethal. There were story moments where your only choices were either a gay or trans mage to lead Tevinter into the future. An idea that would never sit well or come to pass with the actual real Tevinter Imperium. And this wasn't me being anti-gay. This was established in the lore for years at this point. This society was built on slavery, death, and forced magical marriages, and it was all suddenly feeling and looking nothing like it should have been or promised. And Veilguard was not the final nail in the coffin. It was a raging fire that burned down almost 2 decades worth of games and lore to the ground, all in the name of social progress as their developers would claim. Dragon Age Veilguard was the biggest disappointment in gaming for me, and the more that I played it, the more I came to the realization that the series that I loved, that I adored, hell, I have the Grey Wardens and Inquisition banners hanging in my room. I'm a true BioWare fan who wears the N7 logo on my jackets and hoodies, and I suddenly just felt betrayed by what I was playing. I felt like Dragon Age was no longer what it was anymore. Not to say the game was not straight enough, Dragon Age was never really that to begin with. Even older BioWare games allowed you to be straight or gay, but they always did it with respect and made it feel realistic. But in Veilguard, it was clear that the lunatics were indeed running the asylum. There wasn't anyone who made this series leading the charge here, and if there was, it was very obvious that they too had caved into this cult-like virus that was ravaging games for years at this point. Veilguard was a travesty, a god-awful experience that I don't wish on any fan of the series to experience themselves. And when I hear that the entire writing staff was gutted and let go from the company, I really didn't feel any sadness. BioWare was one of my favorite studios, and they were making so many classics that I love and I still do to this day. But it was clear that over the years, this activism has rotted out the core of so many studios and franchises that I love. Dragon Age, Batman Arkham, and more. It just made me depressed knowing that these things I loved were just being turned into utter garbage. Dragon Age Veilguard to me is how Star Wars fans felt after that new trilogy. They felt disrespected, left behind. And it was obvious that the new direction was made for nobody but the people who worked on it and the other weirdos, I guess, who thought like them. Then there was this clip recently from Yotei. She's a content creator where she got footage of this other YouTuber person or Twitch streamer named Veilguard. They're a trans content creator who was very defensive of Veilguard for obvious reasons, and following the news, Veilguard said this, and here, watch.
Because Veilguard chose to represent, I guess. I don't know. However, it's just a lot. It's just a whole lot. Because now I'm in a position where I don't think BioWare is on my side. And that's... I'm in a position now where for the first time, I don't think BioWare has the right intentions.
Yotei didn't feel like Veilguard or BioWare was on their side anymore, but the truth is that they never were to begin with. They weren't making Veilguard for someone like Veilguard. They were simply using them as a chess piece to push an agenda. And the moment the ball dropped and the Reaper came reaping, they threw Yotei to the side like a toy that they no longer wanted to use. And this is what I mean. BioWare was not making Veilguard for either me or someone like Yotei. They were simply making it for their small group that could never reasonably support a game this size. A multi-million-dollar project that was siphoning time, creativity, and the livelihoods of developers to create something that was nothing more than a vanity project for Activism purposes. Then being a viable product. I hate Veilguard with all of my being. I think it truly is one of the worst releases in the past 5 years and then some. But it's incredible to witness BioWare not only rejecting people like me, but even the trans players they so desperately wanted to pander to. But clearly, they were just using them like a ladder to lift themselves up ever higher. One person said this via Reddit. Chuds ruined BioWare. Hope you assholes are happy for ruining the careers of many employees. If you didn't like it at all, you had to do was ignore it and let the ones who do enjoy it, but you had to review bomb and hate grift the game, and now BioWare is on its last legs. You all must feel so proud and are edging to Asmongold videos in celebration of EA gutting BioWare. Dear Mobius Galaxy 99, you're an idiot. You don't understand how any of this works. People just ignoring Veilguard would have just placed this game in the same position that it's in now, if not worse. I can already tell by the way you talk, you probably also think that communism was a good idea for the world. The truth is that these games, like all other games, need to sell. It would be different if Veilguard was made by two people with a budget of $1,000 and it lasted like 3 hours long, then sure, it could be for you, I guess. But this game was a sequel to a multi-million-dollar award-winning franchise. And the scathing truth that I think many people like you are coming to quickly realize is that there are in fact not as many out there who think or act like you do than you think. The truth is simply that Veilguard failed not because of the online grift as you say, it failed because they catered to people like you instead. The kind of people who have a hive mind mentality. Look, I won't even lie, my side at times or any other also has a hive mind mentality too. It's not exclusive to you guys. But it's very apparent that whenever things go wrong, the blame is almost never actually concentrated on where it really needs to be going. Instead, your side always places the blame and faults of your actions onto others, and it hasn't worked then and it won't work now. We are not to blame for Veilguard failing. The same way it is no one's fault that a restaurant closes except those who were in charge of what that restaurant sold and offered. You can point the finger all you want, but ultimately it's the fault of the ideology behind this game, the tenets, and the cult-like behavior that led to its own downfall. I'm not saying don't put anyone gay in it, but Veilguard was overwhelmingly flooded with LGBTQ+ characters to the point that it was kind of parody. Every villain was a white man or woman. Even the main villains, Gillenade and Elgarnon, were distorted versions of themselves in-game but were originally white themselves because of course they're evil. The game has an inherent hatred of white people specifically, unironically forgetting that it was a franchise primarily written by and made by white men themselves. It's a tale told 1,000 times. A thing gets made, then those people leave to do other things, then the thing that was made gets co-opted by people who didn't make it, and now want to take that thing, Dragon Age in this case, and turn it into what they think it should have been all along. It's Star Wars, it's Marvel for a time, it's DC, it's a lot of these things. All ruined by people who never made the things they claim they have every right to have access to. It doesn't help knowing that the writers of Veilguard have of course landed their next job prior to the game's failure, as people found out they're now working on Ghost of Yotei next. I should probably also point out that Erika Ishii, a voice actor who is of course very vocal about all the usual things these types of people love to parrot about, was one of the female voices for Rook in Veilguard, and of course, she is also the main character in Yotei as well. It's just birds of a feather. They just keep migrating together from one sinking ship to another. And then you have to wonder, how these things keep happening? Why do these types keep getting work when their track records are so clearly just leaving utter devastation in their wake? Eventually there will come a time where there isn't anything left to ruin, no franchise that hasn't already been dragged through the mud like a bloated corpse by these types. The jury is still out on Yotei, whether it'll be good or not, but if the people who wrote Veilguard, that got fired by the way from BioWare, are working on that game now, consider me definitely worried, and that's putting it lightly. Another great franchise that could be potentially ruined and then left to sink behind, as these people will inevitably go and find the next ship that is still floating so they don't die. I'm tired of this, you probably are too, and the culture war has clearly consumed everything, but it has for good reason. There has come a point where lines had to be drawn in the sand because giving even inches to maniacs would result in entire places being taken by them. I mean, how much longer will players allow this to happen before it's too late? Of course we are fighting back. People are not buying these games depending on who's attached to what and if things get said, and these types are like moths to a flame. I showed you Unifade Walker earlier on in this video claiming that BioWare wasn't on their side. Then they said this about Avowed. A few people have mentioned Avowed to me, but I know nothing about it. What do you guys think? Is it looking promising? They are just like the people who ruin these franchises. Don't harass this person, by the way, but I just want to point out how it always just keeps happening the same way. They latch themselves to one thing, saying suck it chuds, it won't fail, then it inevitably always does in fact fail. Then they abandon ship and move on to the next thing, only to say suck it chuds, this is for us, and then the cycle repeats. I mean, unironically, it's kind of funny in a way, but Unifade even looks like the meme of the whole suck it chuds, we didn't sell any games. I mean, look at this, come on, even down to the drink. This then brings me to a PC Gamer article titled, "On a pirate ship, they tossed the captain overboard. Larian head of publishing tears into EA after BioWare layoffs waste institutional knowledge." The article details what Cromwell, the same guy who refuses to admit that identity nonsense poisons everything, and I have criticized in the past, and he's also the publishing guy at Larian Studios, the Baldur's Gate 3 people. Anyway, he said this: "It is possible not to lay off large parts of your development teams between or after projects. Critically, retaining that institutional knowledge is key for the next. It's often used as an excuse to trim fat, and to an extent I understand that under financial pressure. But doesn't that just highlight how needless the aggressive efficiency of giant corporations is? I'd understand it if they were pumping out hit after hit. Perhaps you could argue it's working, but clearly the aggressive streamlining layoffs aren't. It's nothing but cost cutting in the most brutal sense. It's always people lower down the food chain that suffer when it's clearly strategy higher up the food chain that's causing the problem. On a pirate ship, they toss the captain overboard. Video game companies should be run like pirate ships." I gotta say, for once, Cromwell actually speaks sense here, because I am actually going to agree with him here because I think he's right in this case. Video game companies should indeed run like pirate ships because it's almost always the higher-ups that of course choose what gets made and how the things get done. Corinne Bush, the director of Veilguard, left BioWare as things were imploding and then landed at Skeleton Key, which is a Wizards of the Coast Dungeons & Dragons studio, as game director. They left before BioWare could place the blame on them, when it was most certainly their fault that Veilguard became what it was. Like I said, activists leech things for money, clout, and energy, and then they leave when the husk is dried out. BioWare laying off all of these people to the point where they are now less than 100 people at best, but still keeping the people at the top who made the majority of these decisions, it will only lead to similar results because the same captains, so to speak, of said pirate ships are still having access to where the ship is going when they should be shark food instead. The institutional knowledge that Cromwell speaks of is actually a good point too, credit when it's due. Think about it. If you make something and keep the people who made the thing on, they will be better and easier to create the next thing because they obviously already know how stuff works, the flow, and how all the people work together. It's sort of like a restaurant. A seasoned team that knows the strengths and weaknesses of their coworkers will always work better than a fresh startup who knows nothing about one another. For example, look at Rio Studio, the Yakuza Like a Dragon people. How are they able to essentially pump out a new title almost every single year? It's simple, because they retain the talent, they invest in the talent, and they make them feel valued. So when a new project is started, there is little downtime, so to speak, to get people up to snuff on how to make a Yakuza game because everybody knows already. Weirdly though, this is not practiced as much in the West. In Eastern countries, retention rates of employees are far, far higher. Most people in places like Japan, they usually get a career and then they stick with it their entire lives, whereas in the West, people are they're seen as disposable, let's be real. And this is why usually following most AAA releases, talent leaves to other studios, contractors and such get laid off and whatnot too. They essentially use these people to get the rocket into the launcher to shoot it up into space. And once it's careening over the stars, they then clean house and try to retain more profits for themselves instead. But in doing so, the Western way of doing things results in having to make each game from scratch all over, both from a content perspective as well as hiring and so on. Every game then has that awkward period where things aren't working, people don't know how to do things properly, because you keep shedding talent only to bulk up again to inevitably shed them all over. BioWare is in that period right now, although in a much more extreme sense. Then you have places like Ubisoft with Shadows. Half the team for that game is juniors, they even admitted to that. So you can only imagine how brutal it was to develop Shadows when half of your team doesn't know what they're doing from the get-go or have made a game in the first place. And frankly, it's just unfair to the people who are at these companies that actually know what they're doing. Because now they gotta teach people while also doing their own jobs, but of course their pay never changes, it's just expected of you. And I know for a fact there's plenty of people watching this who have worked jobs where they needed to train new hires but got nothing in return. I know I did. But then there's Electronic Arts CEO Andrew Wilson, who said the reason why Veilguard failed was because it lacked live service elements. No, I'm not kidding, that's what Andrew said. But it's not true. Inquisition sold 11 million units as a single-player game. Nobody cared about the tacked-on multiplayer that was half-baked at best, as the article states. Regarding Dragon Age the Veilguard's inability to reach a wider audience, Wilson said that games must align with the changing expectations of players who prioritize shared world features and deeper engagement alongside compelling narratives. In other words, he expected the game to have been more successful if it had featured live service elements. This man really thinks if every game just became like Madden, it'll be successful, not realizing that the audiences for games like these are completely different in every way. If that's true, then why did The Witcher 3 sell well, Andrew Wilson? Because that game has zero live service elements as far as I can tell. Same goes for something like Skyrim, or any of the From Software games that get replayed all of the time. Having a battle pass doesn't put a bandage over the game when the core values and vision of the product at hand are completely flawed from the get-go. The fact that they're resorting to shifting the blame like this, it tells you everything. They really never want to take responsibility for their own actions, and it sickens me. This is what the whole pirate ship mentality means. Andrew Wilson sits at the top of EA, and he has driven so many franchises into the dirt that it's actually insane. Dragon Age, Dead Space, Army of Two, Medal of Honor, not to mention just studios in general like Pandemic Studios, DreamWorks Interactive, Bullfrog Productions, and more. All of these things and places failing, that doesn't even include the sorry state that Battlefield has been in for years, all under the watchful eye of Andrew Wilson as CEO. Removing the identity politics from the equation for a second here, the other big issue is just who runs Electronic Arts at the top. These are greedy executives that simply want to turn every player into money mules that they siphon cash from with their various live service games. For an example, in late January 2025, EA stock dropped to its lowest since 2008 after its many other franchises failed to deliver. Their stock dropped a massive 16.7% year over year, with titles like Veilguard underperforming, as well as their typical money cash cows like EA Sports FC 25, which is their new soccer game version thing because EA is too cheap to pay the FIFA license fee anymore. Anyway, here's what CEO Andrew Wilson had to say to conveniently circumvent his decisions as to why EA lost so much money last year. During Q3, we continue to deliver high-quality games and experiences across our portfolio. However, Dragon Age and EA Sports FC 25 underperformed our net bookings expectations, said EA Chief Executive Andrew Wilson. This month, our teams delivered a comprehensive gameplay refresh in addition to our annual Team of the Year update in FC 25. Positive player feedback and early results are encouraging. We remain confident in our long-term strategy and expect a return to growth in FY 26 as we execute against our pipeline. When will it finally be said that EA is just not a good home for many, if not all of these franchises pretty much? Because I'm confident had EA not swallowed up places like Visceral, we would still have Dead Space. And I'm also pretty confident that if BioWare wasn't a part of a publicly traded mega company, they could have been like Larian Studios right now too. It's all a combination of sheer hubris from the very top as executives refuse to admit their own failings combined with the lack of morals and vision that just leads to people getting hired in positions that they have no business being in, being given the keys to a kingdom that they didn't create, to then use as their own personal playground to increase some graphs so that Andrew Wilson can present it to a room full of suits who clearly don't play games in the first place. And their ultimate realization at the end of all of this is that this failure, this loss of revenue and stock, it's not their fault, it's actually your fault. Because you didn't buy the games, you didn't support the things that you loved, even though they were being bastardized in front of your very eyes. All of this is your fault, dear viewer, for not buying Dragon Age Veilguard or buying the next identical soccer game EA spits out every year like clockwork that has barely any meaningful additions to its gameplay loop or core experience. How convenient that whenever there's praise, they are there to celebrate stating that they did it, but when there's loss, it's suddenly not their decisions that led to these things happening, even though they signed off on these things anyways. By the way, you want to know how much Andrew Wilson made due to mismanaging EA so poorly last year? $24 million to be exact. He made more money than any other executive did in gaming in 2024. His base salary, by the way, is $1.3 million. And about $20 million of that is extra in the stocks that he has with EA. He actually made 22% more in 2024 compared to 23. And he earns more than 170 times the average employee does at EA, and then some based on what I could find. This guy is clearly killing EA for his own greed and others. And he's allowing these ideologues to ruin the franchises that we all love by spreading their political filth into franchises that have no business having it in the first place. Andrew Wilson may not be making games himself or know how to program, but he is killing everything they stand for in order to line his own pockets. And inevitably following these financial failures, when EA has to make cuts, of course it won't be Andrew who goes. It'll be the normal devs at other studios that will pay the price because the executive can't give up his 170 times the salary of you because he screwed up. Oh no, it's your fault instead. It is ludicrous how backwards EA has been running for years. If they didn't have Respawn Entertainment, they would be cooked most likely. As well as they also survive off of microtransactions pretty much almost exclusively with their sports titles too. But then they have the audacity to say that Veilguard failed because it wasn't more like Madden. You have to be kidding me. The fact my beloved Dragon Age is in the clutches of a company that allows activists to ravage it while not realizing the gold they have in their hands is beyond infuriating to someone like me. BioWare has clearly imploded within. Devs have lost their jobs due to activism, and yet the CEO still made record profits anyways despite the losses. And they're framing it as being our fault for not being good consumers. I hate it here. None of this is okay. I really don't think that BioWare will learn their lesson, and they're currently on their last legs. With Anthem and Veilguard already 2 strikes in a row for them, this next Mass Effect is make or break. And then even if it does become a successful game, what's the likelihood that the people who made that game even stay considering how Western dev culture just loves shedding all their workers as soon as the finish line approaches? I guess we'll see. But as a massive BioWare fan who feels like they've been kicked in the teeth way too many times to count, my faith is small and I no longer have trust anymore. Veilguard was a misfire, and it's all due to greedy executives and moronic activists. We need to fix gaming, so I'll just keep doing what I do, but thanks for being here, subscribe, and I'll see you soon.